Hello, class. Welcome to week 3. Hopefully, by now you're starting to get into a little bit of a rhythm here, since already gone through week 1 and week 2, and starting to kind of hopefully enjoy the course. Obviously, as you're starting to gather around as well, there's a lot of stuff and still a lot of material to go through, a lot of different things to think about as we start to look at how strategy works and the specifically what it means when you look at strategy for competitive advantage. Now, just very quickly, I wanted to recap. As you know, I'm not in this week, and so this should give you enough time to be able to catch up and work on some of the areas that you should be looking at for week 3. There are quite a few things that you should be doing in week 3, so just kind of very quickly review with you the assignments for week 3 itself. Again, you can go back to the assignment inventory and deadlines just to check in terms of dates and what's you need to be providing. But just give you a sense of what needs to happen here. You need to be able to provide a summary of week 2. So again, there's instructions on how to do that. Kind of gather your thoughts and feedback on that in terms of the summary for week 2. You should also be providing your case 1 summary. And this is Tom's shoes, right? You should have been submitting that as well. You should now also be looking at case 2, in this case Tesla, and starting to look at the analysis of Tesla. And finally, you should also be looking at, you should be completing the quiz at the end of week 3 as well. So again, dates are there. You should also be starting to look at the strategy topics that you're looking as a group. So start looking at what's included in that part of it as well. All right, great. So that's some of the topics. Again, the fact that I'm not in this week, you can use this time to catch up on some of that material, start to review some of that. I think this is actually a very interesting week in terms of all the different material and areas that we're going to be covering. So use the time that you're not in class on this week to work on some of that other material. All right, so let's look at this week in terms of what we are covering. As you recall, last week we talked about the external environment in terms of what that means for strategy. This week we're actually going to be covering the internal environment. So let's just recap a little bit in terms of what we had talked about last week and what our focus will be for this week as well. As I mentioned last week, it can be helpful to think about strategy in terms of frameworks and looking at a framework in terms of having 2 components themselves. Last week we talked about external in terms of the framework, and we looked at, for example, the economic perspective in terms of the industry. We looked at the areas that make a firm most competitive within the structure itself. We also looked at the where a company should compete, and that was really the emphasis in terms of where it should compete. But this week, what we really are looking at is the internal factors that help a company frame some of these strategic decisions. Things like the core competencies of a company, and we'll get into some of those areas. We'll also be looking at some of the specific business operations and decisions that a company can make. And in this case, when you look at internal perspectives, you're looking at how a company should compete. When we looked at the external perspective, we're looking at where a company should compete. So in this case, we're looking at how a company should compete. And what's also interesting as well when you walk through the internal perspective is that in some ways the internal factors are actually something that are more in control of a company. So and within a company's ability to operate, as opposed to the external factors, where sometimes it's something that is not something that you can easily influence. We saw this last week, as you may remember. We were looking at the firm's external environment. The framework is still the same, whether you're looking at the external versus the internal environment. It's still the same in terms of developing a business model, right? So when you think strategically about a firm's internal environment, what you should be doing is obviously forming a strategic vision, or where do you think the firm needs to head, and then looking at the strategic options for the firm, and identifying where the most promising areas are. And then finally, actually selecting the best strategy for the firm itself in terms of the both the strategy and the business model itself. So let's get into it. Let's look at the first topic, which is really the idea of the resources and capabilities that you need to be able to build up as part of your strategy in terms of the internal environment. Now, this is a really important chart. I think we should spend a little bit of time on this because at the end of the day, what we are trying to do is trying to create strategy. Are you creating strategies at several levels? And we look at the various levels that we have here. The first area I think that we should be considering here is the planned proactive moves to attract customers and outcompete rivals via design, features, high quality, selections, lower prices, and so on. So the idea here is that you want to be able to create these proactive moves, planned moves. It's important to recognize that the success of a business doesn't come by happenstance, right? It needs to be planned for, and it needs to be planned based on a particular strategy that you have within in the organization, right? And you need to make various moves to, in this case, attract the customers and compete with the rivals and so forth by these different areas that we look at. What we also need to be doing, and we talked about this last week as well, is really start to look at the changing conditions in the macroeconomic environment. We looked at the framework in terms of how we could actually go about working on these, right? And so the idea is that we need to be looking at the external factors, in this case, the macro environment, what's happening in the industry, as well as particular competitive conditions. And so when you look at these factors, right, is really building the competitive advantage based on a couple of factors, right? How do we build a competitive advantage? We're looking at the lower costs. Do we come up with a competitive advantage based on just cheaper? So for example, one of the competitive advantage that Walmart brings to the table relative to, say, Target and a couple of the other stores is that they continue to drive down prices. In fact, as you know, Walmart is very, very famous for that. And so it is something that they have a competitive advantage on. When you think of low prices, you think of Walmart. Or you might have a different or better product offering. Again, taking the same example here, Target relative to Walmart. What is it that Target brings to the table compared to what Walmart brings to the table? In some ways, you could argue that Target has a different or perhaps even better product offering compared to Walmart. When you go into a Walmart, for example, there is typically a limited range of product offerings out there compared to Target, where you can see even designer brands and you can see a lot of these different products that are perceived to be better. So the question really becomes, that's the kind of the competitive advantage that Target brings to the table. The other thing to look at in terms of competitive advantage is a superior ability to serve a market niche, or perhaps there's a specific group of buyers that these companies are looking at. So I'll give you an example of my own company that I'm currently working at, Acuity. In this case, the idea here is that it's really a niched product, a niche solution. You probably haven't heard of Acuity at all. But in the banking market, and you're looking at the idea that banks need these particular services and support, what Acuity provides is the actual ability to create these efficient bank routing numbers, bank payment schemes. And that's, again, something very specific, very niched to that market itself. Only if you're in the industry itself would you realize the benefits of that. So in this case, it's not something that's generally available. So the idea here is that you're also looking, when you're building a competitive advantage, at these three factors, right? Is it cost? Is it a different product or better product offering? Or is it the ability to serve a market niche or a specific group of buyers? Something to think about here. As you go to the right of this particular circle at 4 o'clock, really what you also are looking at in terms of a strategy here is the efforts to either expand or narrow your geographic coverage. Are you looking to go broad or are you looking to go deep? Companies, for example, may decide that they want to be able to expand in different markets, in different geographic areas and so forth. But there may be both pros and cons to that. Tesla, for example, is an interesting company that has really focused initially on the U.S. market from a geographic perspective, and now only really recently starting to expand. China, for example, being a very attractive market for them, and you'll start to see some of the coverage that Tesla is trying to bring to the forefront. Another interesting example is Uber. We all know Uber. We take Uber as fairly common. Uber has actually grown very significantly over the past 3-4 years, and they've grown very significantly internationally as well. So to the point that in my travels, whenever I am in a different city, when I'm not renting a car, I typically will take Uber, and I'm pretty comfortable that Uber will exist in all the major cities that are out there. But what's interesting to find now is that, for example, in Singapore, just last year, I used to take Uber all over the place. But now the idea of Uber is actually gone. It was taken over by another company called Grab, Grab. Feel free to look them up as well. But Grab essentially bought out Uber in that particular market in the Southeast Asian market. So you'll start to see Uber pulling back for various factors, right? One of the factors could be they overexpanded and they saw too much local competitive threats, and they saw challenges in their home base in the US, for example, and so they wanted to start to pull back as well. So I think it's important to recognize that a strategy as well is to think about the coverage of where the company is looking to expand or narrow in that aspect. Finally, here at 5 o'clock, looking at the idea of building competitively valuable partnerships and strategic alliances. Now, here it's interesting because what companies also do is when they look at building these partnerships, there are a couple of things that they have in mind here. Number one, it could be a partnership from the perspective of actually expanding their geographical territory. So they may decide to go with a joint venture with a company overseas, and that will help them to expand or at least meet one of those objectives through a partnership or a strategic alliance. And so the idea here is that it's not only to be able to expand, but also could potentially be able to expand their product base. Right? There may be products that the company itself may not have or may take time to build. Again, let's go back to Acuity, the company that I work for. We are looking extensively in being able to expand our product sets. And part of that also looks at interesting new technologies that can be used. You hear a lot of things about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so there are quite a few of these fintechs, these startups, that have these types of solutions. And so from the perspective of Acuity trying to make a decision as to whether they should build a partnership or build it themselves internally, it always comes down to speed to market. Is it quicker or is it more cost effective to partner with somebody that already has the existing capabilities, or is it something to look at developing internally? Again, factors that are important when you start to look at building your business strategy itself. We looked at all these other factors. Now let's look at the functional strategies. Now it's important to recognize that when you look at the functional strategies themselves, the issue starts to become what the different departments within an organization are. And so the question becomes here is, do we have the right R&D, technology, the product design strategy, and so forth? Do we have the capabilities in terms of being able to deliver the goods? In other words, the supply chain itself. What is the supply chain strategy here in terms of working with, either with partners or distributors or suppliers in terms of getting your product to market? Are there issues, for example, when you're looking at large geographic regions? Or, for example, the goods may be perishable. So goods are perishable, for example, if you're a fruit exporter or you're a flower exporter. What is the challenge there in terms of being able to ensure that your products get to market in a state where it's consumable, right? You're not gonna, for example, export mangoes from Latin America only to find that it ends up in, say, Chicago, all rotten or not even ripe. So it really is a challenge in terms of being able to ensure that they have the timing correct. in terms of being able to distribute their products. Then the question really is, the next one really talks about the production strategy. What is it that we are producing? How are we producing it? Are we getting the right raw materials to use, the components required to be able to produce those products in a cost-effective manner? Going back to Acuity, for example, we are a technology company, so we don't necessarily manufacture widgets per se. It's really more a question of developing code. And so a software company's production strategy is probably very, very different from an automaker's production strategy, right? Because based on the type of inventory that's required and the type of go-to-market as well as the way they produce those products. It's also different, for example, for a consulting company. A consulting company per se does not produce anything. They use resources, they use manpower, they use soft power, soft skills to be able to develop their products, as opposed to, as I said again, a car manufacturer or a product supplier that rely on inventory that's required to be able to produce that. Same thing when you start to look at the sales, marketing, distribution strategy, right? Sales, marketing, distribution, of course, a key functional part of any organization. Without sales, typically nothing happens, right? And the difference between sales and marketing in this case is really all about the ability to create the, marketing creates the need broadly. Sales goes out and delivers that need specifically. And so the idea is what the distribution strategies are as well there. IT strategies really relate more to a ability for information technology, in this case, to support the overall business, right? Do we have the right tools, the right information, the right technologies, the right data sets, and so forth, to be able to deliver for all the different functional areas that it supports. Human resources, of course, very, very key. Without people, it becomes really challenging in terms of being able to deliver goods. In services intensive industries, the human resource factor is certainly key because you need brain power, you need resources, skilled resources to be able to deliver your products, versus in capital intensive type of firms like the auto industry and so forth. The key is to make sure that you have the right parts, right? You got the steering wheel, you got the tires, you got the crankshaft, you got the engine, you got all the different components that make up a car, and that's very capital intensive. So it's really while human resources are certainly key, skilled labor is certainly key. It's slightly different perspective when you look at from a software company, where the soft skills, the ability to create code, and the skills required in developing that code is primary. You of course need your basic computers and so forth, but the idea is you're really creating these types of services and software solutions. And finally, for any company, finance is really, really key. You've gone through your finance course, and so the idea here is that finance, in terms of being able to allocate the right, release the right investments to ensure that we get the right products at the right time, be able to manage cash, to be able to be efficient in terms of servicing your debt when you borrow. These are all important components to make up the finance strategy itself. Again, all of these key functional strategies, when combined with the various perspectives in terms of the in terms of what's required, all help to build the business strategy. And as we know, the business strategy in this case is really the action plan, right? So you need a business strategy for managing a single business. So hopefully that made sense, and I think it's important, as I said, to really key. This is a great chart that I think you should be continuing to go back to revisit, and making sure that you have the right components when you're actually building up the strategy here. Okay, so we've talked about the various components that are required to build up that strategy. And so let's kind of get a little bit deeper in terms of recognizing what's required. So in order to get to that business strategy, you of course must have those resources and capabilities. We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? You got to have competitive assets. And what do we mean by competitive assets in this case? It's the assets in terms of the resources and capabilities. And the idea is to make sure that those resources and capability are competitive enough and be able to succeed in the marketplace, all too often you find that a company that struggles in terms of being successful in the marketplace struggles because of the assets that they have. They're no longer competitive, right? So they may have resources, they may not be adequately skilled in terms of being able to create new products, for example. Or you may have machines, or you may have production capabilities. They're not competitive anymore. And so it becomes a real challenge for the company to be able to continue to develop that sustainable competitive advantage. And so the idea here is that you want to make sure that your assets are competitive, right? So just kind of a distinction when you look at resources versus capabilities. When you look at resources, what you really are looking at in terms is the idea that that particular resource is a productive input or competitive asset that's either owned and controlled by a company. So in this case, you have a fleet of oil tankers that are competitive in terms of being able to distribute those throughout the markets that they serve, as well as a capability, right? In this case, it's the capacity of the firm to be able to perform that particular activity proficiently. So in this case, it's great, you have marketing, you want to have the skills. So for example, if this is a consumer-driven company, consumer products, and then your marketing will probably have more superior skills in terms of social media, be able to promote their various products and so forth, especially if you're, it's a brand conscious type of firm. And so the idea is that you want to make sure that you have that capability in place as well. Very quickly here, when you look at resources, I may have mentioned it earlier before, you're looking really at the tangible versus the intangible resources. And so the idea here is that you've got, when you look at tangible resources, you've got physical resources, financial resources, technology assets, and organizational resources. I think that makes a lot of sense. When you start looking at intangible resources, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge because it's typically harder to measure by definition, right? So when you look at human assets and intellectual capital, it's really tough to actually measure some of that. And so when you have companies that do lots of mergers and acquisitions, especially companies that focus on development of software or services and so on, the idea of protecting intellectual capital is really, really, really key. Acuity is an organization. In fact, we are in the business of buying companies, and so when we do buy companies, one of the things that we want to look at is to make sure that we're able to retain the assets, the human assets, because they have that intellectual capital that if for some reason that they leave, may significantly impact the future of that particular product or brand. And so it becomes an important factor, especially for companies that rely on these types of human assets. Certainly the brand equity is something that's intangible. It's interesting. There are many, many studies that are done in terms of the value of brands. And I'm sure most of you have taken a marketing course. When you look at global brands like Nike, like Apple, like Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, the list goes on. And so the idea of being able to value those brands, in some ways, it's a bit of a challenge, right? It's not a physical thing in any sense. It's really intangible. But the idea is that you want to be able to value those brands as well. Same thing with external relationships, building those pipelines, those integration channels, those distribution channels, those production channels, and so forth, are all intangibles that need to be able to be assessed in terms of their competitive capabilities. And finally, the company culture and incentive system. How good is that? How progressive is that? How competitive is that particular company culture? It's interesting when you look at NASA. Let's take a quick case study. NASA, as you know, back in the 60s, they had a mission, right? They had a mission, and that was a mission that was clearly outlined by the president at that time, John F. Kennedy. I think we all know the speech. I won't get to the specifics on the speech quite right now. But what's interesting is that when he gave that speech, there were some studies done in terms of the human resources, the folks that actually worked in NASA. They actually interviewed a janitor, And so they asked him, well, what do you do in NASA? And the common response that you would think about is, well, I sweep the floors, I clean up, I empty the baskets, and so forth. But that's not what the answer was, and which really kind of surprised some of the researchers. His answer was, we put a man on the moon. So that's interesting, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the company culture was driven, and that they had a really focused mission, even all the way down to the janitor, right? I mean, it's like you can think of the engineers and the rocket scientists and the astronauts and so on and so forth, all thinking that they were planning on going to the moon, right? But you don't think of the excuse me, the lowly janitor in terms of what his role is in terms of going to the moon. So that's something to think about as well. How competitive is that, right? So you have a group of staff that are all focused on that same mission and have that same company culture and the ethos as well as the incentive to drive towards that. You have a very competitive intangible resource in this case. All right, so let's move to the next section here. Whoops. Keep having a good challenge here in terms of moving the slides forward. Let's look at the types of capabilities very quickly. I think we talked about it earlier as well. The key in terms of ensuring that we have competitive advantages in terms of the capabilities. But the point here is that really trying to understand how to identify that, right? The capability. Understanding the intangible but the observable capacity of the firm to perform that critical activity, I think it's key, as well as ensuring that the capability is competitive in the sense that you've got knowledge that's based in people and based in this intellectual capacity, and to be able to understand the organizational processes and functional systems. So that's why when you look at staff that have been around a company for a long time, the fact that they have tacit knowledge, which means that they have understanding of how that company works, and it's not necessarily something that's put on paper. A lot of times companies spend an awful amount of resources, consulting assets, and so forth, trying to kind of put together the workflow of how a company works in terms of taking it from step A to step B to step C to step D and so forth, right? A company in some ways is a collection of processes, workflows, and so forth. While you can put that down on paper, the employee's experience and the tacit knowledge of who to go to and when to go to is in fact very, very, very key. And that really demonstrates capability. So it's important to recognize that tacit knowledge as opposed to explicit knowledge is also key in terms of a organization here. How do you analyze this? Well, you look at the idea that you want to actually be able to assess the competitive power. And so when you look at the competitive power itself, we look at that resource or capability. Is that valuable? Is that resource rare? So for example, if I am now producing something in the financial technology space and you need programmers, are those programmers, those types of programmers rare? Is this something that rivals lack? So if you have, for example, a whole bunch of Python programmers, this is a programming language, compared to some other companies, and they lack that, you certainly will have a competitive advantage. And is that resource hard to copy? Now, the resource could be hard to copy because the idea may be that the entrance to that particular market or that particular industry could be tough. So think about the electric car, Tesla, right? Again, it's a case that you should be familiar with, given that it's our second case in terms of a case study. Now, the idea of actually building an electric car is actually quite hard, right? You need all the infrastructure, you need the resources, you need the know-how, you need the gumption, you need the capacity to be able to create that electric car and be a success in that. And it becomes really challenging. Certainly, you have the other automakers starting to catch up here, but in this case, we all are very clear that Tesla has a real lead in that electric car space. So it becomes really harder to copy there. But the question also becomes, is that resource, are there good substitutes available for that resource? So let's kind of step back in terms of the electric car. Now, I agree with you that it's hard to copy a electric car, But when you look at transportation, when you zoom back a little bit and you look at the idea of transportation, whether it's electric car, whether it's bicycle, whether it's diesel car, whether it's a petrol car, you know, each of these types of vehicles gets you to point A to point B. The question really, are they good substitutes? Now, certainly a train and a bicycle, while they're both forms of transportation, they're not quite good substitutes, are they? Because really the reality is that it takes an awful long time to get from, say, Chicago to Detroit by bicycle when you compare that to a train. And so it's really also important to understand when you look at the context of substitutes, it's important to understand what you mean by substitutes, what are good substitutes for that particular resource itself. So also always look at it in the context of the industry that you're trying to serve. Okay, great. Let's look at the second topic, and in this case, we're looking at SWOT analysis. I think all of you may have heard of SWOT analysis one time or another. You probably may have come across that in some of your marketing courses, or perhaps in your undergraduate courses as well, when you look at how you would be able to do some of these types of strategy analysis. But SWOT is a very popular tool. Let's kind of dig into it. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. No surprise there. But what we need to also look at in terms of the framework by which we can use a SWOT analysis, you can use it for looking at it from both internal as well as external perspective. What I mean by that. Excuse me. Now, when you look at strengths, the idea here is really, at the end of the day, strengths is really the basis for your strategy. It's what you build off of, right? So it's easier as an organization to identify what your strengths are. And then that's what you kind of base it off of in terms of all the other analysis. Versus your weaknesses. What you're trying to look at in terms of weaknesses is really what your deficient capabilities are, what you're not so good at, right? And that's really what weaknesses mean. When you look at your opportunities, what you're trying to do is use opportunities as a basis for being able to establish your strategic objectives. Versus threats. What you're doing here is you're looking at your strategic defenses. So that really the difference between the opportunities and threats here is really the idea that you've got these objectives that you're pursuing from opportunities versus your threats in terms of defenses there. When you look at the strengths, you're trying to identify the internal strengths. The idea here is that you're looking at the degree of competence in your organization. And this is, in some ways a variable scale here. You've got competence, you've got core competence, and distinctive competence. It's key to be able to identify what they are. Let's look at, first of all, what the differences are, right? Competence really, at the end of the day, is really an activity that, a firm has learned to perform with some level of proficiency. Really, it's just a capability. So, for example, the idea of, you've got, a marketing function or a sales function or a finance function, or the case may be. These are processes, these are activities that you perform with some relative degree of proficiency. And so that's really a capability. Versus a core competence is something that, as an internal activity, is central and really is part of the firm's strategy and competitiveness. There are sales organizations, for example, the organization that look at sales as a core competence. And so these types of firms can say, we can sell anything, right? Because you've got a really core strength in terms of ability to sell. And so you have these companies like, for example, Procter & Gamble, right? That is I would consider that a sales organization because of the ability to sell a lot of different types of products. And so if you ask somebody from Procter & Gamble and you look at some of their capabilities, they would say that one of their core competence is the ability to be able to sell and to market. That's a really a strong competence for them there. Versus a distinctive competence. A distinctive competence in this case is something that is inherently valuable, that a firm performs that's significantly better than its rivals, right? Go back to Procter & Gamble, for example. You got Procter & Gamble, some other types of consumer product distribution companies include Colgate-Palmolive, for example. So the question really becomes, what do each of these firms have as a distinctive competence? It's sometimes hard to be able to identify that because when you look at both firms, right, they both have different brands. They both sell fairly well. And so the trick for a firm to be able to identify their internal strengths is, how do I categorize each of those particular functional areas in terms of whether it's a competence, a core competence, and a distinctive competence. It's hard to do, and so it becomes a real lengthy exercise. And that's why the SWOT analysis is actually a very valuable tool to be able to help do that. So here's some examples of strengths in organizations. You've got the idea of being able to have competence in quality, in reputation, in manufacturing capabilities, distribution, the ability to innovate, financial management, the cost position, customer service. So when you look at each of these particular strengths, right, each of these types of areas, a company can look at their competencies and decide where they have either a distinctive, a core, or a basic competence in. You could argue, again, that Apple, for example, one of their distinctive competencies is in the ability to innovate, right? Again, you could argue that compared to, for example, Samsung, right? And so, typically you have Apple coming out to the market with various interesting, innovative products, and Samsung in some ways playing catch up. Again, this is arguable. You go back and forth on some of those things, and it becomes really difficult in some ways to really identify a core competence versus distinctive or basic competence for a organization. So something that you can certainly continue to dig into. Let's look at weaknesses. Weaknesses in this case really is a competitive deficiency, something that a firm lacks or does poorly compared to others as well. And so it really puts that particular firm at a competitive disadvantage. And so these types of weaknesses include things like inferior skills, physical or organizational or intangible assets or deficiencies. One example of that could be the airline industry. There are quite a few of airlines out there that like to advertise and promote new planes, right? And why do they do that? In fact, it's interesting. Some of the budget airlines, surprisingly, like Southwest Airlines, is actually a fairly young fleet, and they're a fairly standardized fleet. I don't know whether if you travel Southwest Airlines recently, but all their planes are Boeing 737s. They actually stick with that, and the reason they stick with that is because from their perspective, it's a lot easier to be able to maintain those planes. They try and keep their planes fresh and new, and so from their standpoint, then they have the flexibility of being able to drive down their costs, because the cost of maintenance is going down, because they don't have to keep parts for different planes. And if one of their planes does break down, they can easily bring in another 737 with probably the same seat configuration and be able to park at the same types of gates in various airports. So it makes it a lot more flexible from that standpoint. So, Southwest, when compared to perhaps some other airlines that may not have as a young a fleet, may have a comparative strength compared to, say, for example, a Delta Airlines that may have a older set of planes, and that could be a competitive deficiency from them. Or they could be even have missing or inferior capabilities. So it's important to be able to review the types of strengths and identify where the organization is deficient. Let's look at opportunities and threats. So for example, in this case, there are different types of market opportunities. You have the absolute must-pursue market, you have marginally interesting markets, and you have unsuitable or mismatched markets. Again, it's fairly easy to say that in terms of trying to identify the types. The trick is to be able to understand for that particular firm what type that particular market opportunity looks like. It's really interesting, right? So especially when you look at the financial technology, the computer industry, the new advances that are happening out there, there are a lot of bets that are being placed out there in terms of interesting market opportunities. I'll give you an example. There is something called a blockchain. You may have heard of it. You may have heard of digital currencies. The challenge is that as these markets tend to grow and they evolve very rapidly, the challenge for companies that are looking to plunge into those areas is to ask themselves, what type of market opportunity is relative to that particular firm itself. And so it becomes an exercise, and the SWOT analysis helps do that. The other aspect of it here is now looking at the threats themselves. And the idea here is that you want to be able to identify what those threats are and what some of the events or the forces outside our control. These could be normal course of business threats versus sudden death threats. I like to think of it this way. When you look at normal course of business threats, threats are threats. It's not something that you can necessarily avoid, but it's something that you can plan for, right? So if you recognize that there's obsolescence coming in, maybe the material is starting to get depleted, you can start to plan for that. Or when you know that your inventory is shrinking, or that your equipment is aging, you can plan for those types of activities, and that becomes your normal course of business threats. Versus sudden death threats, right? In this case, these are unplanned events. It could be a regulatory change, for example. It could be a tariff that's all of a sudden put on a particular set of products, group of products, that could significantly drive up the cost of imports, or could significantly be a challenge in terms of the disruption of those parts into a supply chain. Those unplanned for types of threats are really challenges, right? Because these sudden death and that you haven't planned for, and they can be really damaging to your market strategy and your opportunities. All right, so let's wrap up here. Let's look at a couple of things that we've talked about, right? So when you look at SWOT analysis, we ask ourselves, what does it really reveal, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to draw conclusions from that SWOT listing about the firm's overall solution, right? Situation, excuse me. What you're trying to look at is, where is this particular firm in terms of how weak it is to how strong it is, right? Does that attractiveness of where does it rank, right, in terms of the weakness versus the strength of it? What are the attractive and unattractive aspects of that company? You also look at, then from that SWOT analysis, you translate these into strategic actions by the firm that could either match a strategy to its external strengths and to market opportunities. And what then you can then do is really look at the ability to correct your important weaknesses and then defend it against those external threats. So again, to summarize, SWOT is actually a really good foundational tool. I think you'll get a lot deeper into it in terms of the opportunities, in terms of using this. Certainly encourage you to learn how to use this particular framework, how to use this tool, and apply it not only to the case studies that we'll be looking at, but also to your businesses. It'll be interesting to see whether when you look at your topic strategies in terms of the presentations, whether you use this particular tool. I certainly encourage you to use those tools. And so good luck as you work through week 3 and move on to week 4. If there are questions, obviously you know where to find me. Look forward to hearing back your comments, and look forward to seeing your output from week 3. Take care.